The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Encirca's webinar on dotBANK. Are you ready? This webinar will be a primer for banks interested in the dotBANK domain name extension. I'd like to inform you that all slides can be downloaded at www.encirca.bank. After the webinar, there will also be a recording of this webinar at the same address. So here are our presenters this morning. First, we have Craig Schwartz, FTLD Registry Managing Director, managing dotBANK and .insurance domain registries. He is also former Chief Registry Liaison with ICANN. Then we have John McElwain, partner of Nelson, Mullins, Riley & Scarborough. He focuses on intellectual property litigation and strategy. Voted one of the best lawyers in America from 2013 throughout 2015. He is also Vice Chair of the Internet Committee for the International Trademark Association. And finally, we have President of Encirca, Thomas Barrett, the first dotBANK accredited registrar, founded in 2001, the sole registrar serving on FTLD's Security Requirements Working Group. Encirca is also a trademark agent for the Trademark Clearinghouse. This is our agenda for this morning. We'll start off with an introduction to new GTLDs, or top-level domains. We'll move on to dotBANK policies, trademark protection, and then finally registration process and costs. Throughout the webinar, if you do have any questions, feel free to enter them into the question box in the lower right-hand corner of your GoToWebinar widget. All questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Tom Barrett to introduce us to new GTLDs. Tom?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're undergoing a rapid expansion on the Internet right now. You all are of course, familiar with .com, .net. There's about 22 of those types of extensions and another 240-plus country code extensions. But since the start of last year, there have been over 600 new extensions have been added to the Internet. .ninja, .rocks, .nyc, .london. And under this expansion, all of these new extensions need to make sure that trademark owners are protected. And so they have something called a sunrise period, which you'll hear about in a second, which allows trademark owners who have a national registration to provide their trademark to something called a trademark clearinghouse and then be eligible for the sunrise period prior to the general population. All of these new extensions must also be registered via ICANN accredited registrars. You may be familiar with GoDaddy or Network Solutions. There's about 15 or so accredited registrars who are supporting dotBANK today, and of course Encirca is one of those. And we'll hear more about the timeline in a second. dotBANK is entering Sunrise in just next week, and then we'll start general availability the third week in June. The operators behind dotBANK are also launching .insurance in the fall of 2015. So how is Bank different from all these hundreds of other extensions that are launching out there? It's interesting. There's also a .trust launching out there as well, and I was asked recently how .trust is different from a .bank. Well, first of all, dotBANK is owned and led and managed by the banking community, and it truly reflects the desire by the community to create a place online for secure online banking that consumers can trust. It has very strict eligibility criteria. You must be a licensed or chartered bank in order to get a dotBANK domain name. The domain names that you request must correspond to names that you are currently using in commerce, and we'll talk more about this in a second. And there are strict security requirements in terms of use of your dotBANK domain name, as it is designed to ensure that it's a safe, secure environment for consumers. So I'll hand this off to Craig, and he'll talk more about the dotBANK policies.
Thank you, Tom. Move on to the next slide. So a little bit about FTLD Registry Services, and Tom already mentioned that we are a community-oriented company. We're owned, operated, and governed by banks, insurance companies, and several trade associations. And our goal is to serve and protect the sector, which is why we are rolling out dotBANK and ultimately dot-insurance in a much different way than the hundreds of other domains that are being made available. As Andrew mentioned in the very onset, that Encirca has been involved with our security requirements working group to come up with the controls that are mandated by FTLD, by both our registrars, those are the entities that sell our domain names, such as Encirca, and ultimately the registrants, or those entities that purchase domain names. And these set of requirements are intended to make dotBANK a trusted, verified, and more secure location on the internet. We've also got an advisory council that is active in weighing in on our policies and procedures. It's, if you will, a second layer, not quite of governance, but of accountability for us, in that we have a board of directors that makes decisions about the direction of the company, but we've also got a council that weighs in on where we're headed, so we're accounting for a broad range of stakeholder input in the formation of our policies and procedures. Tom already mentioned dotBANK is launching actually this week. We'll start with our qualified launch program that opens on May 13th, which is tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And noted at the bottom are our key technology partners, VeriSign, which is our infrastructure service provider, or the entity that helps make our registry operate. Symantec is our verification agent, and they'll be the entity that is conducting the verification of eligibility. I think there's a more in-depth slide later in the presentation that Tom will go through about Symantec. And then, of course, we have select ICANN registrars. We have currently, I believe, a number of 17 registrars as of today. Encirca is obviously one of those that are authorized by us to distribute our domain names. And you can find information about them on our website at ftld.com. Next slide, please. So strict eligibility for dotBANK includes these groups of entities. For the most part, we would expect the vast majority of registrations in dotBANK will be made by banking organizations themselves. We've gotten questions about whether, for example, bank holding companies can register domain names. And the answer is bank holding companies are not eligible themselves, but they could potentially register domain names on behalf of their eligible subsidiaries, or that is the banks themselves. However, the contact information associated with that registration must be for the eligible entity. You can see the second to the last bullet includes industry service providers. We commonly refer to these as either core processors or technology service providers. Some of the more common names that you may know are Fiserv or First Data or FIS or CIS Web. And these are organizations that play a critical role in the bank's operations, whether it's being responsible for their web presence, whether it's being responsible for their online bill paying function. We know that many of you rely on these service providers to make your bank website work, and therefore we felt it was important that they be permitted to participate in the domain. It may be that they're working behind the scenes with dotBANK domains and not actually having a consumer-facing presence, but again, that would obviously be up to them on what they choose to do with those domains. Next slide, please. So Bank has enhanced security, and here are several examples of what is required either by registrars or by the banks themselves. And it's important to understand that registering and using your domain name in .bank is really a two-step process, and that is we encourage banks to engage with the registrar as early as possible in the process to make sure they understand what their requirements are, and then activating a domain name, or that is using it, which must be done in compliance with all of the security requirements, could potentially come at a later point when the bank is ready. Certainly we have mandatory verification of charter and licensure, which will be done with your regulatory authority, whether it's the FDIC or the OCC or the Federal Reserve. We will be checking charter information. Domain name security extensions, or DNSSEC, is a technology, basically a cryptographic mechanism for ensuring that when an internet user is trying to get to mybank.bank, that they actually wind up where they intended to go and are not redirected or misdirected to some other type of site. Email authentication is a way of effectively advertising to email service providers like Google and Hotmail and Yahoo and Microsoft that your company either doesn't use its domain name for email at all, and or it uses the domain name for email and thus identifies the IP addresses of the servers that are used to generate email. The value in email authentication is to mitigate spoofing and phishing and to stop bad emails from being delivered to your customers that might otherwise get through on another type of domain name. Enhanced encryption is intended to protect data that's communicated over the internet. It's not actually encrypting the contents of an email or of some other type of transmission, but it's more a point-to-point encryption, that is your server to another entity's server, and protecting the integrity of the data that happens in that communication. Multi-factor authentication is really something that registrars are responsible for. So if you're working with Encirca, they will have a mechanism implemented that requires you not only to have a username and password to access their system to change your registration data, but also some other piece of information, such as a code or information that's provided via an SMS text message or some other mechanism. So it's a way of controlling who has access to your registration data at the registrar, and thus inhibiting the ability of some third party to change that data and perhaps affect the way traffic to your website is directed. A prohibition of privacy and proxy services effectively means that the registration data associated with your domain name has to be that of the bank, a real person's name, a real company name, a real phone number, and not that of some third-party proxy provider. The value here is, and the cost for this is primarily driven by requests from law enforcement that proxy services make it really difficult for them to track down the bad guys when an email is being, or when a web domain is being used to propagate some illegal or harmful activity. And then finally, the requirement to use .bank name servers. And again, I believe Tom will get into this in a little bit more detail, but we do require that all name servers be hosted on .bank. It's the only place where we have some level of control over security and stability, and thus you will need to either work with your registrar, your core processor, your hosting provider, or your DNS service provider to make sure that this requirement is observed. Next slide, please. So naming selection for .bank, again, we have requirements around this. During the QLP, or Qualified Launch Program, for founders, which starts tomorrow night, probably not applicable to most people on call today, and for Sunrise, during these two periods, your domain names have to have to be an exact match to the name that you registered in ICANN's Trademark Clearinghouse. Han is going to speak about that during his presentation. For the general availability period starting on June 24th, which is when most banks will be eligible to participate, the rule is that your domain name must correspond to your trademark, your trade name, or your service mark. It doesn't mean that you have to have a registered trademark. You could, for example, have obtained a common law right to use a mark based upon use in commerce over an extended period of time. And for us, that's perfectly acceptable. We get questions all the time that says, do I need to have a registered trademark to get a domain name in .bank? And I have to answer that question in two parts. The first part is, if you want to register during the sunrise period, you must have a registered trademark that qualifies for inclusion in ICANN's Trademark Clearinghouse. When you get to general availability, the naming policies are a little bit more relaxed, and that's when the corresponding rule comes into place. You also cannot register a reserve name, and there are FTLD reserve names, and there are ICANN reserve names. Those are all posted on FTLD's website at ftld.com/resources. I think they're probably also on INCIRCA's website. Moving on, domains are limited to alphanumeric characters, so simply A to Z and 0 through 9. Currently, 1 and 2 letter names. So an example of a 2-letter name as noted on the slide is AA.bank. Those are currently prohibited. We are embarking on a process with ICANN to release the 2-letter names, and when and if that should happen, we would make that information available on our website. And then noted here in the last bullet, our common community names and generics are reserved. Citizens, community, national are some examples. What you could do, if you happen to have one of these names and you'd like to use them, is you could modify it in a way that it would be in compliance with our name selection policy. So if you are the Community Bank of Mississippi, while you couldn't register community.bank, you might consider communityms.bank or cbms.bank or some other form of your name. And I think if we go to the next slide, we get to see some examples of the corresponding rule. So here you can see a number of names. These are all fictitious, and what might be some corresponding domain names. So a way you could structure your domain that is in compliance with our policy. Move on to the next slide, which may be the end of my section. So it is. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Craig. I'd like to remind everyone, if you do have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to enter them into the question box on the bottom right-hand corner of the GoToWebinar widget. We will address all questions at the end of the presentation. And now regarding trademark protection, I'd like to hand it over to John McElwain. John?
Thanks, Andrew. So trademark is important in the domain name system for 3 reasons. First, it's going to allow registration into the trademark clearinghouse that we've heard about and I'll talk about in a bit more detail. Second, it allows for sunrise registrations in .bank and in other top-level domains. And third, it allows a bank to protect its mark from having others use it in a corresponding domain name. So I'm going to cover in my presentation here the intersection of trademarks with .bank, which is primarily going to impact the timing of a bank's ability to register a domain name. So we have here a timeline of the launch process, and I'm going to just hit a few of the terminology here so that this slide hopefully makes good sense to everybody. So first you see the initials TMCH, which stands for the Trademark Clearinghouse. The Trademark Clearinghouse is the entity authorized by ICANN to serve as a repository of trademark registration data. It is not related to the USPTO, United States Patent and Trademark Office, although they both deal with trademarks. Next, we have the sunrise period. The sunrise period is an early registration period open to holders of trademark registrations that have then recorded those trademark registrations with the Trademark Clearinghouse. The general availability period, or the land rush period, is the point in time in which any person meeting the .bank eligibility requirements can register a domain name in .bank. As you see here, we recommended that the Trademark Clearinghouse is completed before sunrise, although the sunrise is going to be on a first-come, first-served basis, starting at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on May 17th. So there still is time to put a mark into the Trademark Clearinghouse. At this point in time, that process is taking about a week. So as you can see, that approval necessary to register in the sunrise might now happen after sunrise launches, but you still would be able to get into the sunrise period, which again begins on May 17th. And then, as Craig has mentioned, general availability, which is the period open to all banks, starts at 8 o'clock Eastern Time on June 23rd. Go to the next slide. So to talk a little bit more about the sunrise period in the Trademark Clearinghouse. Again, the sunrise period is the early registration period available only to banks that have a trademark, a federally registered trademark. It is restricted to records in the Trademark Clearinghouse that have been issued an SMD, a signed mark data file. That is the week-long or approximately week-long process that I've mentioned. When a record has been recorded in the Trademark Clearinghouse, a signed mark data file will be issued, and that is what you will need to go forward with a sunrise registration. Keep in mind again that allocation during the sunrise period, which lasts for 30 days, is on a first-come, first-served basis. Also keep in mind, as we'll hear Tom going over more later, that the verification requirements still must be passed. So by having a trademark registration, it is no guarantee that a .bank domain name will be issued to you. You still must have that verification passed. And also keep in mind that the corresponding rules that will also, we heard Craig speak about, such as the ability to span the dot, does not apply during the sunrise period. It is only available to exact matches. In other words, the mark that has been recorded in the Trademark Clearinghouse must be an exact match to the domain name that you are seeking to register in the sunrise period. In the general availability, all those corresponding rules apply, but not in the sunrise. That's not a rule that .bank has. That's actually a rule that ICANN has required for all sunrise periods for all new GTLDs. Move to the next slide. So just sort of to summarize here, when to register, when you have the ability to register in the sunrise, it's going to require that you have a federal trademark registration, and you're going to have to want to have an exact match of that trademark registration to the domain name that you're seeking within .bank. If not, you're going to want to wait till general availability. So when to register in general availability, it's when you don't have a federal trademark registration, or you want a .bank domain name that's not an exact match. So an acronym and abbreviation. We'll go over those corresponding rules in a bit more detail. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Andrew.
Thank you, John. And now regarding .bank registration process and the costs, I'll hand it over to Tom Barrett. Tom?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, John and Craig, for that overview of .bank. I want to give you an idea of how registrars will interact with you and their role in the .bank process. And many of this should be familiar to you. You will go to a registrar website, put in the name you want, and the name is checked to see if it's available or not. Obviously, if we're talking about a few months from now, a lot of names will no longer be available. But right now, the check is looking to see if the name is reserved or not. We then submit the name for registration, and it's put into a hold status so that no one else can get that name while the bank is undergoing the validation process. A company called Symantec has been hired by the registry to conduct that verification process. They'll reach out to the bank, confirm that the bank is eligible and the name they're applying for is valid. And once they gain approval, that name is then released from the pending status and is registered to the bank. Now, the domain name does not need to be activated right away. And in fact, so the bank has time to decide when and how they're going to activate that name. And the registry and Encirca will come out with a migration guide to help banks through that process. So you can continue to run your existing website for as long as you deem fit until you're ready to move over to dotBANK. So let's talk about the verification process for dotBANK. This happens after the name has been reserved on your behalf. So we know it's available, we've secured that name, and then Symantec will conduct the verification process for dotBANK. And they'll do a variety of steps. They'll do a security check, a background check on the bank. They'll make sure that your license or charter is still in good standing. They'll verify that the names that are being requested do in fact correspond to the names that the bank has in use. They'll verify the physical postal address, the phone number, and more importantly, they'll look at the person, the individual who made that application on behalf of the bank, and they'll make sure that person is a full-time employee of the bank, and that person has been granted authority by the bank to apply for those names. So it's very important when, if for example, you do use your core processor to help you with this name, and we're working with several already, that the full-time employee of the bank is used as a contact person, and that the HR department or their supervisor is prepared to take the phone call from Symantec to confirm that that person actually works for the bank. That process should take around 2 days, and it's repeated every 2 years by Symantec. In terms of the activation process, the way Encirca will work anyway is we are focused first on securing the name on your behalf and ensuring you pass that verification process. And so initially the names may not resolve, and so there's no requirement that they resolve or be activated right away. So you can continue to use your .com website. When you do bring both your new .bank domain name up and running, you can still continue to use your .com website. There is a requirement, however, that your new .bank domain name use what are called DNS name servers that end in a .bank. And so you will not be, this is not the same as the DNS name servers that host your current website. So next slide, please. So I've described for you what happens in a real-time type of situation. Because .bank is a first-come, first-served type of allocation, it means whoever asks for a name first will get it. So you don't get any priority if, in fact, you have a .com website. You don't get priority on the domain name you're currently using. .bank is a global top-level domain, so there are banks all over the world applying for those names from close to 20 different resellers like Encirca. And so first come, first serve is going to be critical for both general availability as well as Sunrise. So what Encirca has been doing for the last several months now is we are offering a free pre-screening service where we will make sure that the names you're applying for do correspond to your existing .bank names or marketing slogans. And most importantly, once we confirm the names you're applying for are eligible, we will insert your order into what we call a submission queue, so that at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll automatically submit your names and make sure they're secured on your behalf. We do have some optional services, which I'll describe in a second. I'd like to go on to what the pricing is for dotBANK. And the pricing is $999 a year. This includes the pre-screening service, the verification fee, and the registration fee. And we do allow you to basically pay by any payment method that you're comfortable with. And so if you prefer not to pay by credit card, you can start the pre-screening process now and say, I'd like to pay later for this process. As long as you submit to us a bank check or bank wire or ACH prior to the start of the registry, that's fine with us. And there is a refund available if for some reason we are not successful in getting your name, minus a processing fee for the bank, for the registry. I'm sorry. So if we go to the next slide. So we've talked about pricing, and again, these we've already discussed pricing a little bit, so we'll move on a little bit to the next slide, talk about our optional services. So as I mentioned earlier, and Craig mentioned, there are some additional security requirements for .bank domain names that you may not have with your current website. First and foremost, they must use .bank name servers. Encirca's solution to this is to use your own .bank domain name for those name servers. And so, for example, if you get bankname.bank, we would create for you as part of our service vanity, what I call vanity name servers, ns1.bankname.bank, ns2.bankname.bank, and this ensures you're in compliance with the registry's requirements. We would add in the DNSSEC and DMARC requirements. We would also provide web forwarding, and this subscription is $199 a year. It covers all your .bank domain names that you might decide to register, and we do have banks applying for multiple names. And if you choose to later consolidate your .com domain name or other domain names, it also supports any other domain names you might have. So again, this type of DNS is required in order to activate your .bank domain name. We do have banks that are applying for multiple names, but they also say, look, there's a primary name I want, and I have a backup name which I only want if I can't get my primary. And so we call that our fallback service. So it's a one-time fee for $200, where if you're unable to secure your first name, we will then submit a second order if and only if your first choice was not available. Next slide. So what should you do now? As we've mentioned a few times earlier, there is a sunrise period happening next week that requires you to have a registered trademark that's also submitted to the Trademark Clearinghouse. We are processing applications for the Trademark Clearinghouse today, and will be doing so for the next several weeks if you do have a registered trademark. But it's important to remember that a trademark in the clearinghouse is not required to participate in .bank. And so we suggest that you start the process and go through our pre-screening process to find out what names you're eligible for. We can certainly tell you if you have competition that might be applying during the sunrise period. But that's good to know, so that you can pick a fallback name for when you are eligible in general availability. And most importantly, once you have your names selected, we will insert your order into our auto submission queue to ensure that you're the first in line basically for the names you want. Next slide. So we'd like all of you to insert any questions you have into the GoToWebinar widget. We'll try to answer as many as we can. We also invite you to go to encirca.com/bank and start that pre-screening process. There is a no-cost obligation for that process. And then we would also arrange to have a free phone consultation with you to answer any questions you might have. If you have any questions about whether or not you have a trademark and whether or not it's eligible for the Trademark Clearinghouse, feel free to contact us or John McElwain, whose email address is john.mcElwain@nelsonmullins.com. That's all we have today. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll hand it back to Andrew to go through some questions.
Thank you, Tom. We have a couple questions. Let's jump right into it. The first would be regarding the sunrise period. If a bank has a federally registered trademark, do they have to be in the Trademark Clearinghouse prior to sunrise period registrations?
I guess this is John. I can handle that. So you must have a recorded trademark in the clearinghouse to obtain a SMD file. That SMD file must be uploaded during the sunrise process. It's sort of your key to be allowed to take advantage in the sunrise period. So although if you haven't registered your trademark yet, there is still time to do so since the sunrise period, if you have not recorded your trademark in the clearinghouse yet, there is still time to do so since the sunrise period lasts for 30 days. The process for obtaining a U.S. trademark is over a year now, so there's no opportunity to register or to apply to register and then take advantage of the sunrise.
Right, and just to add on to John, we have been telling people we would like, if you are interested in Sunrise, we would like to start the Trademark Clearinghouse process as soon as possible, which hopefully is before the start of Sunrise, especially if you have a competitive name that other trademark owners might be applying for. We can certainly tell you if that's the case. There's a 30-day Sunrise period, so technically we could continue this process right up until mid-June, but I would advise people not to put it off.
Okay, thank you. And now regarding the Trademark Clearinghouse, we have a bank that has a trademark published for opposition period. So the opposition period ends towards the end of May. Can they go through the Encirca pre-registration now, or must they wait until they are registered with the Trademark Clearinghouse at the end of the opposition period?
This is John again. So you can start the process at the Trademark Clearinghouse with an application. It will not be finally approved until you provide evidence of that trademark registration. So yes, you can start the process, and unfortunately, under those time frames, it will be very difficult to get a registration in time. But it's still a good idea to give it a try.
Okay, thank you, John. And now, I believe the second part of that question is to be directed towards Tom. Do you also suggest that without the SMD file, do they fill anything out with Encirca, or do they wait until they have the SMD file from the Trademark Clearinghouse?
Well, we would certainly like to know if you intend to apply during Sunrise. What we would want to do is find out, the typical turnaround for a pending trademark with the USPTO, I believe, is up to 18 to 24 months. So if you just applied 2 months ago, it's not likely you're going to be approved in time. But if you applied 2 years ago, then you're closer to possibly getting approved so that we can get you through the Trademark Clearinghouse. So we certainly need to know that's your intent so that we can track the progress of your filing.
Okay, thank you. And regarding banks that do not have federally registered trademarks, Can they start the pre-screening process now for a .bank domain name, or do they have to wait until June 23rd?
So this is Tom Barrett again. We already have a substantial queue of people who have been pre-screened for general availability. So I urge you not to delay. I suspect this is true of any other registrar. There's already a line that's been formed for both Sunrise and general availability for people who have gone through the pre-screening process.
Okay, thank you. Moving on away from the trademark clearinghouse, I believe this question may be for you, Craig. You mentioned that one-letter domain names are blocked. Is there a way to unblock a one-letter domain name for a bank?
So correct. One-letter domains are currently not available. We have what's called a reserve names challenge policy, which is posted on our website, where a bank or otherwise eligible entity could challenge the inclusion of a single letter name on the reservation list, and he would have to file a complaint with us according to that policy, and then there would be an internal process for review. If it's something that we couldn't resolve, it would then be escalated to an independent third-party arbiter called the National Arbitration Forum. So there is a process, and eligible organizations can certainly avail themselves of it. When we created the reservation lists and the name selection policies, our intent has never been to deny a bank or otherwise qualified or eligible registrant a domain name. However, it must correspond to their trademark, their trade name, or their service mark. And I can't think of too many examples off the top of my head where a single letter does that, but a registrant or an applicant is certainly welcome to challenge that.
Okay, thank you, Craig. And now, regarding the advanced security requirements for .bank, this may be in relation to SSL certificates, but will .bank websites begin with HTTPS versus HTTP?
That's correct, they should.
Okay, excellent. And moving on to the .bank name servers. So the general impression means that a bank cannot use their own name servers. They have to purchase an additional name server for .bank.
So that they can't use name servers that their current domain name uses. So the key is that name servers have to end in a .bank domain name. And so what we're advising banks to do is to use their own .bank domain name as their name servers, but they cannot use whatever they use today for their current website.
And would they be able to use the .bank name servers for their current .com website?
Right. So again, as we've said earlier, you can continue to run your existing .com website without interruption for as long as you want. And in fact, bring up your .bank website in parallel. You can at any time decide to move over your .com domain names to the name servers. That won't change your current web host in any way. Again, that will maintain just the way it is. It just will allow you to manage the domain names more efficiently.
Great, thank you. And as a last question, this is another technical question. We have a bank that is using a proxy server to manage internet access to their bank. How will that affect the .bank verification process from Symantec?
So I'll take a shot at this, Craig. You can chime in too. But the verification process is not going to look at how you run your systems today. They don't care how you currently host your banking website, what core processors you use. They're making sure that as a bank, you are legitimate, that you exist, and so they consult third-party sources and they make sure that the person who applied is in fact an employee of the bank. So they're not looking at all at the systems such as proxy servers that your bank might be using.
Thanks, Tom. And I would have answered the question the same way.
Okay, great. We have no further questions at this time. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for a webinar on dotBANK. I'd like to thank the panelists, John, Tom, and Craig. You have all been very helpful today. If you do have any questions, please feel free to email Encirca at dotbank@encirca.com. If you have any specific questions regarding Trademark Counsel, please feel free to email them to John at john.mcelwain@nelsonmullins.com. Again, this webinar can be found at Encirca's website, encirca.com/bank. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.